know. Actually, I just had a really good question, an admin question here. This isn't the exact question, but it's close. Is attendance compulsory? No. There is no record of whether you come here or not other than my memory. And my memory is pretty good though. And yes, my experience is the first class and the last class are the two busiest classes by a long shot, which is fine. I don't take it very personally. Oh, sometimes I do, but not really. No, it's completely up to you. You are grown-ups. And in fact, we are unable to make anything compulsory, though to be fair, it's pretty hard to pass if you don't show up for the exam, because it's worth 50%. And I think if you didn't do either of the first assignments, it would be pretty hard to pass as well. But the reality is nothing is compulsory, and there's no record of your attendance or otherwise. Having said that, if you are an online student who decides that you want to come to class, firstly I'd say right now there are no seats for you, but we make that work. But I would appreciate it if you are an online student and you're not really supposed to be in this room, if you let me know. In the number of years since 2012 that I've been teaching, I've only been evacuated once, but it's a good idea for me to be able to tell people if we are evacuated who it was that was in the room. And so we can check off. We know face-to-face students, we can check that you're all safe if something goes wrong. But if you're an online student and you've just joined in, I've got no way of doing that. And I've been a girly SWAT for a really long time, and that would keep me up at night. Plus, I like to know who you are. Okay, let's talk about contract law now. I spent a whole half a class talking about admin-y things and myself, so let's actually talk about the subject at hand. So this topic is really our beginning, our overview. We're examining what it is that contracts are and why we have a contract law at all. And we're going to, in doing so, introduce you to the elements of a contract, in particular the positive elements, and then we'll go on to what we call the vitiating elements. So the elements that go to whether a contract can be enforced or not. And we're also going to start to distinguish between the idea of a valid contract and an enforceable contract. And yep, I'll give you some overview on the different elements as we go. So let me just, sorry, I'm going to go back because my eyesight's bad and I need to be against the wall so I can see this. This is me trying to put on one slide everything that you will ultimately need to know about contract law. So in this subject, we cover the elements of formation. Now, this is a mantra that you are going to say over and over in your heads. In order for us to have a contract, we need to have these four things. The first of them is agreement. For the time being, we're going to think about agreement as meaning an offer that is matched with an acceptance. We're going to start to talk about that in some detail next week. Offer and acceptance is not the full story, but it's enough for us now. The next element that we need is consideration. Consideration, for now, we're just going to call that price. Again, it's not the full story, but let's think about that as price. We need certainty. In other words, we need to be certain what the contents of the contract are, what the contract covers. And we also need there to be an intention to enter into a legal relationship, an intention that an agreement is binding. These things are interrelated with each other. We spent 2 weeks talking about agreement. 2 weeks talking about agreement because we necessarily have to talk a little bit about all of the others in order to get there. But take it from me for the moment, you've got no basis for doing this other than that I'm getting paid to be here and you're paying to be here, that those are the things you need to have a valid contract. The next thing that we look at are the matters that affect formation, which can be vitiating elements. So they are privity. Privity is just a legal technical term that goes to who the parties to a contract are. are you a party to the contract or not? Because if you are a party, you will have some rights and some obligations, and if you are not, then you will not. Formalities. So formalities are the things that you need to do to formalise the contract, to put it in writing, to have it signed, those kind of things. And then capacity. Are you able to enter into a contract? Here we talk about it, capacity in terms largely of whether or not a human being is old enough. But there are lots of different entities or quasi-entities that want to enter into contracts or look like they're entering into contracts, and we have to work out who the parties to the contract are and whether they have capacity. Towards the end of the subject, once we've gone through all of that, then we'll start to work out what the contents of the contract are. What are the terms of the contract? Which ones are express? Which ones are implied? And what happens when there are terms that limit or change the liability of the parties as between each other? And that, my friends, is everything that's going to happen in this subject. Then, when you go into advanced contract law, you're going to look at all of these other things. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but we're effectively, in advance, looking at the ways that a contract can be discharged. Again, a technical term, but we're talking about ended. And also the ways in which a contract might be vitiated, so not enforced, as a consequence of some of these things. We talk about the ways that contracts can be terminated, but also ways that they will never be enforced, where they're void or voidable. So that's everything you do across the two, and we're spending a lot of time at the beginning. And actually how this will work, the topics don't align neatly in weeks. You might have noticed that. We will spend 2 weeks on agreement and 2 weeks on consideration. Then we will have the next, that will get us through to week 5. I think we'll have 1 week then on certainty or intention. Can't remember which way around it is, probably certainty. And then we'll start to go rapid fire. We'll have 2 weeks after the break where we do 2 topics in a week, twice over. Now, the thing is, a topic is not a unit of measurement, okay? Some topics are big, some topics are small. That's the way we have 11 topics, and we have 1 week reserved for revision, but to actually break them up week by week, we would be going home early a number of times, and we would miss a whole lot of content if we did them differently. The other thing is, sometimes, particularly when the classes are big, it will feel to you that I'm going too slow at the beginning. We will move a lot faster later. It will not be, I promise you, at the expense of the content. This is about getting it right up front. So, I would like you to grab your phones if you don't already have them while this wakes itself up. And, oh, I hate it when that happens. I thought I had already logged into it.
Is this personally, or it could be in a work setting?
The last, whether it was for work, for someone else, for yourself, maybe you've never entered into a contract. I don't know. You can say that. It's a big group here. Basically, the first 40 of you will get in because I pay for this one, so I've got the cheapy licence. I want you to just bring up as many, well, you can think of anything that you have entering into a contract. Last contract that you entered into. Joining a gym. I love it when people join gyms. We've got a few coming up very quickly. Once we get 40 of them, yeah, you'll get kicked out. So leases, a couple of there, hiring a babysitter, purchasing dinner, somebody's on fire. Last contract you entered into. Buying a sandwich. Didn't need to be, I don't think you needed that question mark there. Buying sushi, purchasing land. I haven't seen, oh, bought a new home. That's pretty, oh, bought a new home, that's pretty cool. One of the things I want you to see here, contracts come in many different sizes, shapes. Often, and I haven't seen it yet, a number of people will say, I've never entered into a contract. You guys have worked this out. You have entered into a contract. You enter into contracts every day. Chances are, the last contract I entered into was on my mobile phone up there on Cardigan Street when I plugged in the numbers to agree to pay for parking for the half hour before I came up here. I think that's the most recent contract that I entered into. Contracts don't need to have significant pieces of documentation with them. Some of them, things like entering, these all move around now, don't they? Things like entering into, well, enrolling in the JD, contract with, and chances are there was also a side contract for some of you with the Commonwealth Government in relation to fee help. But things can be big things like enrolling in a JD or entering into a, buying a house or a lease or something massive. But buying a sandwich is still a contract. Topping up your MyKey, paying for parking, they're still contracts. So let's think about then what those things have in common and what they have that are different from each other. I'll share these results later. Mail order bride. I don't know who you are, but we're going to get along really well. Not because I'm into mail order brides, by the way, but because I just think there should be more laughs. Oh, an engagement. Now, is this, I won't out anybody, but an engagement, getting engaged, is that a contract? A marriage could be a contract. Actually, for some time now under Australian law, there used to be this idea of a breach of promise relating to a promise to marry, but a marriage is actually a statutory undertaking. Partners agree with each other, but it's actually treated as a statutory undertaking and not as a contract as such. So the old breach of promise in relation to somebody letting somebody down in relation to a marriage is no longer got, but it's actually excised out largely to bring it in line with modern thinking about the way humans should treat each other. Yes, so you have to tell me your name now. Everybody has to tell me their name because otherwise I'll never learn them.
Oh, Anna.
Nice to meet you, Anna.
Nice to meet you too. I just want to say, is that the marriage, because there's no price there, so it's not.
That is very good thinking. Can you hold that as a thought? It's actually, it's the reason for pulling marriage out of contracts is as much about ensuring, well, it's actually human trafficking is the thought that came from it, that you couldn't sell your daughter or your son for a couple of goats and expect to get the fiefdom. But yeah, price, it goes to it, but there is still some element of price consideration in a marriage contract. So, but that's excellent thinking. All right, let's keep going. Come on. Yeah, I know you're not accepting responses. I want to go to the next slide, please. Here we go. So, contracts are an integral part of business and society as a general rule. You have read a number of different approaches to understanding what a contract is and why we have contract law. So, and a large part of that first chapter dealt with this classical view, which effectively, so people like Stephen Smith and Charles Fried were arguing that contracts enable parties to create a type of private law. So a law or a set of arrangements that apply in relation to a specific set of circumstances amongst themselves. So ultimately there has been judicial and legislative intervention that has eroded this idea of freedom of contract. And I'll talk about that in a minute as I show you sort of the way that this has evolved. But what I want to do is actually get ourselves into the common law headspace. Let's not worry too much about legislation that has come in over the top to protect particular contracting parties, but look at what a contract is as a common law idea before we sit with the legislative overview. Oh, what am I asking you to do here? I've lost track of where I'm asking questions. This is the question I was just about to ask anyway. So I'm thinking, what have I put on the slide? Again, 40 of you maximum. Have a go at defining a contract. What is a contract from a common law perspective, from an Australian law perspective? Again, completely anonymous. I've got no idea who you are. If you want to defend your answers later, you can do that. The way that these are going to work is they'll start off in a list, and if you see one that you like, you can just vote for it and say that, yeah, I'm just going to agree with that, and we'll see what comes to the top. An agreement between consenting parties, an enforceable agreement between consenting parties, I like that. An agreement to deliver goods or services. An enforceable agreement. So enforceable agreement is very similar. Oh, I've got to get rid of that. Ah! Sorry, what have I done? Clicked the wrong button. Sorry, go back to that. I think I just need to hit the button. It's going to come back up again where it was. No, sorry. Stop hitting my... Okay, so enforceable agreement between consenting parties. I like the use of the word enforceable there, and that idea of consenting parties as in people who intended to be bound. An agreement between two parties to provide goods or services in exchange for some form of remuneration. Again, this is strong too. I like this idea, but I'm also looking for that idea of enforceability. Enforceability goes to this whole idea of contract law as well. An agreement between parties that can be enforced under the law, again, similar sort of idea. When they move around, it's both beautiful and stressful at the same time. Legally binding, some are dropping off the bottom. So we're seeing some patterns here. And we're also seeing it's not easy to do. It's actually not easy to define what a contract is. One of the things that I like about these definitions is I'm not seeing a written document. I'm not seeing references to a form of any kind. And that's something we'll discuss in some detail. The elements of a contract, you're going to start remembering the mantra, are agreement, that's made up of offer and acceptance, consideration, for now we'll call that price, intention and certainty. None of those things are written document with a signature. Now, there will be some circumstances where a contract won't be enforced unless you have a written document with a signature. That we'll talk about when we get to formalities, but it is not a prerequisite for a contract to be made. So ultimately our definition has to encompass all of those things in order for it to be enforceable. So the use of the word enforceable here I think is really helpful. And that idea of agreement, but it becomes circular, doesn't it? An agreement is an enforceable agreement. An enforceable agreement is an agreement that will be enforced. So what is an agreement? An agreement is more than offer and acceptance, though as an element of contract, we're going to talk about it in the context of offer and acceptance and then consensus as well. But we also need to look for this idea of exchange, consideration, price, that something is paid in the most part. I'll share these answers with everybody at the end, but it's not a simple thing to define what a contract is. So the next question for you is, if it's not simple to define what a contract even is, Why do we need a contract law? Why do we need laws to deal with contract? What is the law for? Again, I think this will work the same way, so you can vote on them as you see them if you wish. Hopefully I remember to speed it up in the recording here. To enforce and protect the rights of parties. Again, going to that idea of enforcement, to hold parties accountable. So much of our thinking or the writing about what a contract law is, particularly in the early days, came from this idea, this moral idea that people should keep their promises. We need to hold people accountable so that justice prevails. Okay, contract law provides a solution where there's a disagreement. I think that's an excellent answer, actually. It's actually technically not correct. The contract law won't provide a solution, but it will provide a methodology for addressing the problem solving. It won't just say, you know, if this happens, then the answer is this, but it provides us with a methodology. There's one here too about minimising the effect of imbalances between the bargaining power of parties. Now, the common law doesn't do that. The freedom to contract idea actually has the result that if parties are creating their contract law, their private law, then they can, provided that all the elements of a contract are there, in other words, agreement made up of offer and acceptance, consideration, let's call that price, certainty and intention. As long as we've got all of those things, it's actually not for the court to work out whether it's a good deal or a bad deal. It's actually the role of statute that comes in more recently to look at whether or not there's been an inequality of bargaining power. The contract law itself, the common law, just assumes, and I think we understand that it's a faulty assumption that the parties to a contract can actually agree that they have equal bargaining power. So lots of good reasons there. So why are we doing this? There's a variety of responses that come out of the literature to that first question, what is a contract? Your textbook says that it's an agreement or a set of promises that the law will enforce. So a contract is separate from a social agreement. An agreement giving rise to obligations which were enforced and recognised by the law. Treitel is well regarded contract scholar from the early part of the last century from memory. An agreement that gives rise to obligations. It creates the obligations. Or Carter, any promise which the law enforces on the basis that it's supported by consideration, on the basis that it's supported by price. Again, three similar but different definitions. All of them look to this idea of promises and enforceability. All of them look to obligations in some way, but they're not exactly the same, and all of them have problems with accuracy. It is not an easy thing to say this is a contract and that is not. So what do I think about when I think about what a contract is? And I always tell this story, I probably need a new story, but this is a long time ago now, when my eldest daughter, who is older than many of you in this room, was in grade 3, I got asked to come to Careers Day at St Mary's Primary School in Williamstown. And my daughter was so excited. And then I found out I was going after the firemen. So like basically I'm a contract lawyer, right? I've got the world's most boring job and I have to explain after the firefighter what I do. So this is how I explained what a contract is to a group of 7-year-olds. So, you know, that line from Philadelphia, talk to me like I'm a 3-year-old. So many of you would have spent some time in summers long past playing a game on the street at night in summer. For me and my family, that was cricket. I'm not quite that old, but there are different games. Might be football, might be croquet, might be mahjong, could be anything. You sit outside as kids, you go outside and you play a game. And at the beginning, you write down the rules. Well, you don't write them down, you just agree them, don't you? You don't need a written document. We agree that if ball goes over the fence, it's 6 and out. Have you heard that one before? If it goes over the fence for that cranky lady up the street, then the fielders have to go and get it. You know, whoever's fielding, because she's scary. And you know that if it hits the rubbish bin, then it's definitely out. The rubbish bin is the equivalent. You know what the rules are. But when it's 5:30 at night and it's still quite hot and the dads are drinking beer in the gutter and somebody's little brother gets their first ever go at bat and gets out straight away, nobody really cares if he has another go, do they? But if it's 9 o'clock at night and somebody's mother has been screaming over the fence for the last 15 minutes and you know when you get inside that you're going to be hauled by the scruff of the neck and you're going to be scrubbed behind the ears, then over the fence is 6 and out. There's no discussion otherwise. That's what contracts are. Contracts are not the deal. Contracts are not the game. We say that. We say, oh yeah, I went and bought Google the other day. It's like you didn't. You wrote the document at best, a little bit of the document maybe. And the reality is that when people do the deals, the contract becomes their last resort most often. The contract is, or the agreement, usually written down in commercial situations, but not always, is the lowest common denominator. It is the set of rules for what you will do when things go wrong. It sets out what the parties' obligations are and what their rights are. Now, mostly as a matter of commercial reality, if it suits both of the parties to agree something or do something differently, they will. In fact, there's some pretty solid research that shows that more than 90% of commercial contracts are not actually followed, that the rules are not followed, that the parties just work it out as they go, which is fine when everybody's getting along, but ceases to be fine when they stop. So that, my friends, is how I would define a contract. I think the other thing that's important to think about with contract or agreement is they are nouns and they are verbs. So often when I am talking about the contract or an agreement, I might be talking about the document that it's written down on. But as a matter of common law, there is nothing that requires agreements to be in writing. An agreement is the thing our clients reach. Agreement is a verb. They contract with each other. Contract is a verb in that context. That is what they do. Our job as lawyers is often to write it down or to unpick what happened to work out whether or not the verb is enforceable. So contracts can be oral, they can be written, they can be partly written, partly oral, they can be a mix of many documents. There is no one set format for them. Sometimes legislation will imply some kind of formal writing requirement. And we'll talk about that in some depth when we get to the formalities topic. So things like sale of land, particular types of equitable instruments, they need to be put into writing. So then going to that question, why have a contract law at all? The second question I asked you there. Another way of looking at that would be, why should promises even be enforced? Why do we need a law to make people keep their promises? And the reading you've done, we can sort into basically two categories. The moral explanations, and I toyed with how, I just wrote this slide today actually, and you can tell because it's got a typo in it. The I and the B should be around the other way, and Michael Triblecock, can't say his name, can't say it, can't spell it, it's not a good look. I could have called this economic reasons, but I actually think I settled with practical perspectives in the end. So we have these moral idea, this kind of Anglo-Saxon Christian idea that it is wrong not to keep a promise. Promises need to be kept, that there is an ethical imperative. Some of the ideas work around this idea that parties to a contract have consented to be bound. So by consenting to be bound, they effectively deserve what they get. I'm not quite sure. But ultimately, that idea sits in that moral basket. And then also this idea that parties to a contract do things in reliance that a promise has been made to them. And this we'll talk about in more depth when we get to consideration, this idea of an exchange. I am doing this because you promised to do that. I think the reason, I tend to fall on the other side. I think that the reasons we have contract laws and the reasons why many legal systems have laws relating to contract, even though they might not be the same as ours, come to these practical economic considerations at the end of the day. That ultimately there is an economic efficiency in having a standard way for people to undertake transactions. And I think this even goes to that idea that it is not the role of the courts to decide what is a good or a bad deal. Rather, it is the role of the courts to say, if you make a deal and it satisfies the requirements to be a contract, then it will be enforced, so that there is consistency in the way that commercial people do commercial things. And this, I think, will come out a little bit more as we talk about intention, because the law has long held that one of the requirements for a contract is that the parties intended to be legally bound, for there to be a legal consequence, and that both parties had that idea. The practical perspectives include that security of supply. So bolstering the expectation that if you promise me something, I can rely on you keeping your promise. To ensure clarity and certainty, in other words, that a contract should be clear and precise as to what it is each of the parties is going to do, and then to manage risk. And ultimately, that's a large part of what commercial contract lawyers do. So we identify what risks are associated with a transaction and who's the best party to take the risk. What risk is in or outside of your control and what risk isn't. What is reasonable for you to take on, and the more risk you take on, usually the higher the price you expect to be paid for that. I don't know what's happening. I don't know. It doesn't matter, okay? Time to start. All right, are you ready? There will be 11 questions. What is a contract? And your options are an agreement between two parties, a written receipt or a transaction document, a legally enforceable agreement, or a promise. You will be rewarded for speed and accuracy. Oh, it gets more and more stressful. 9 answers, 10 answers, how many? I think you can use multiple devices. I've never done one of these before.
Yeah, some do.
And the crowd goes wild. Okay, legally enforceable agreement. The reality is, with a Kahoot, they're very limited, a number of words that I can use in the answers. The idea is to go for the least worst of the options. Again, we're pretty much on the same side. Again, somebody's gone with an agreement between two parties. could well be a contract, that's fine, but we've got a better definition with this idea of a legally enforceable agreement. Let's go on. See, and now what it will do is it'll give the teams a score based on accuracy and speed. Okay, what is common law? Are you ready? You only get one choice. A source of personal obligations. Law developed by judges in Australia. Law common to all countries. Law developed by judges in England.
Let's see.
10. Have we got 10 groups? Is that the right number? 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay. So we will come back and have a look at this in a minute, but common law is judge-made law from England. The Australian courts followed the common law well after Federation, and it was really only in about the 80s that we started to move away, and one might say we've moved back a little bit since, but you know, enough said there for the moment. Oops, sorry. Let's keep going. Cash. Climbing up the scale here. All right, classical contract theory espoused the view that parties must have freedom to contract. Is that true? Is that false? Oh, weird music this time round. Oh, 10 answers already in? Because we don't have to wait out for so many sets. Everybody put them... Oop. Okay, everybody's in the same place. Excellent. So what this does, too, one of the reasons I do this is, I know if you get it all get it right, I don't need to talk about it very much. Cash, on fire. Okay, one of the main effects of Maurice Cohen's theory of contractualism. Might be more than one answer, you only get one choice. Non-contractual obligations are not recognised by the courts. Social relationships are the main factor to consider. The intentions of the parties are a key consideration. It was developed to keep the law in line with the law of torts.
Trying to get ready for the weekend. Yeah. And I was sort of like...
You had a lot of theories to read about.
Yeah, so I sort of had to duck out for...
Okay, we've got 10 in. I think we've got 11 max. All right, an even spread. An even spread. So, again, this stuff, like, at the end of the day, that's not a fair question for lawyers, right? Because we're looking for synthesis. That's just a memory, right? You read the stuff. You're now just trying to match who did what with what theory. So, again, I don't want to spend too much time messing around with who did what here, but for those of you who have got the good memories, you feel rewarded when I give you questions like this. What's important about that reading is really immersing yourself in this idea that for hundreds of years, people are still struggling with the idea of, well, what is a contract? And why do we have contracts? And how should they be enforced? So let's see what it looks like. Oh, cash, you're right up there. Which is the cash group? Oh, they're quite achievers over there. A group. All right, having said that, it's not fair, I'm giving you another one. Charles Freed. Contract obligations depend on a system of entitlements. contract law is about self-imposed obligations. The promise is the moral basis of contract law. Or chicken should be served with herbs and spices. So I actually think Charles Fried started with this moral obligation. So Charles Fried's theories are linked into the moral obligation and move into this idea of self-imposed and to develop the idea of a private law. So again, this is an example where we have at least, I think, 3 good answers, but one of them is a little bit better. Actually, I say that one of them is a good answer. I'm actually a vegetarian, so... But I think serve to other people is the way I read that. Okay, so this is a negative. Always read the questions carefully. Which of the following features of contracts do not advance economic efficiency? So which one is not like the others? Reducing transaction costs, increasing opportunities behaviour, providing excuses for non-performance, or gap filling. Gosh, look at the time.
It then projected my answer. And I clicked it again and I loved it. Oh, we're going to move the street.
So, again, for the economists among us, increasing opportunistic behaviour is not something we usually want to do. So there was a kind of logic in that as well. I have just looked at the time and we are running late. I felt like we were doing so well and then suddenly I've lost time. I'm going to cease that there for the moment then. I want to just finish up by showing you, oh, go away. I'm just going to show you something else so that we can stop in the same place. This, maybe it's just because I spent my time doing this today, I want to finish with it because I thought, actually, what do I really want you to know about the development of contract law? And can I put it all on one slide? And the answer is not one you can read on the screen, but I can get the idea onto one slide. Contract law is old. A number of the cases that we are going to look at are ancient. Most of the cases that we look at will come from the 19th century, the late 18th century to an extent, but a large number from the 19th and earliest 20th century. So basically we have this, and take some time to have a look at this, it's in your materials, but basically we've gone from this kind of idea of the covenant through to an idea that there is freedom to contract and that parties can create their own private law. So there are a couple of slides there which clearly we're not going to get time to go through. I'm happy to, in fact I might actually provide some extra guidance in relation to them. But what's the point of all of this? The point is contract law is old. Contract law actually doesn't change dramatically very often. And the reason for that is, in my view, the pragmatic reasons that we started to talk about earlier. Commercial people benefit from a consistent way of commercial agreements being dealt with. And so for economic stability reasons, countries that have a stable rule of law in relation to the way that contracts will be enforced attract investment in a way that countries that do not have those laws do not. So there is an economic underpinning to everything that we do here. It is old. It is developed over a very long time. So and you know a little bit about the way that the precedent system works and how the common law develops. So if we think back to, basically the time of the Magna Carta, pre-1066, people who entered into contracts were, the people who had capacity to contract were basically the guys with the big horses and the swords. And so you needed to be landed gentry, there was a whole system of laws about how contracts could be enforced and who had capacity. Capacity was a much more nuanced idea at that time. And then we've moved through till we get to this 17th century idea of this action in a subset, this idea that actually if you've made a promise and somebody's relied on that promise, that they can bring a claim against you, which then further refines as we get into the 19th century and onwards. So it doesn't move quickly, but the concepts are very old, and the concepts are very old, but they are continually being adapted to fit into our commercial environment. So I will let you go. Do not forget to vote on a time for the drop-in tute. Let me know if you've got any questions, and I will see you, many of you here, next week. Okay. The same for you at home. We will catch up.